In November of 1892, the University of Missouri did something no college football team had ever done before. They forfeited a game rather than play it. Nebraska had a halfback named George Flippin, and Missouri would rather lose than share a field with him. Nebraska's student newspaper mocked them for it, joking that Missouri's objection was just the Civil War fought over again in miniature. Funny line, except within 25 years, Nebraska banned black athletes from its own teams entirely and kept that ban in place until after World War II. The same school that laughed at Missouri for its bigotry in 1892 spent the next several decades quietly practicing a version of it. The first black players on a predominantly white college football team played for Amherst, a small liberal arts college in western Massachusetts. Their names were William Tecumseh Sherman Jackson and William Henry Lewis, and they arrived in the fall of 1888 from the Virginia Normal and College Institute, a school for black students in Petersburg, Virginia. Neither had either played organized football. At Virginia Normal, gym class had meant marching laps around a building. Amherst treated athletics like a moral obligation, so Lewis picked up the sport mostly because the school told him to. He showed up to his first practice in his street clothes. That first day, I got my clothes all torn off and my feet stepped on, he said later. The next day, they gave me a uniform. Jackson actually took the field first in 1889, the earliest confirmed black player on a predominantly white college roster in the country. But it's Lewis whose story really carries this chapter. He got good fast. Lewis became Amherst's captain, the first black captain of a predominantly white college football team in the country. Then moved on to Harvard Law School, where he played 2 more seasons at center and became the first black player named to college football's All-America team twice. Football turned out to be the least interesting thing about him. He became the first black U.S. Assistant Attorney General, appointed by President Taft in 1911, and one of the first black lawyers admitted to the American Bar Association. Jackson's own path afterward was quieter, teaching, then a principalship at a high school in Washington, which is a big part of why Lewis is the name that got remembered. A year after Jackson took the field at Amherst, a Michigan student named George Jewett became the first black letterman in that school's history, then transferred to Northwestern, and became the first black player there too. Michigan didn't have another black football player for 42 years after Jewett left, not until Willis Ward suited up in 1932. But the player whose story really shows what all this actually cost is George Flippin at Nebraska. Flippin, the son of a formerly enslaved man who'd fought for the Union and become a doctor, arrived in Lincoln in 1891 as only the 5th black athlete competing at any predominantly white university in the country. He was huge for the era, 6'2", 200 pounds. He was refused entry to a Denver opera house after a road game. A restaurant in Omaha sat his whole team in a private back room so other diners wouldn't have to see him. When a hotel refused him a room, his teammates walked out with him until the hotel caved, then set up a segregated eating area so other guests wouldn't know he was staying there. He was also the best all-around athlete on campus by a wide margin, setting school records in the shot put and hammer throw and winning wrestling championships on the side. In 1892, in Nebraska's first game against an out-of-state opponent, he scored the only touchdown against Illinois on a 25-yard run after recovering a fumble. And the forfeit against Missouri actually changed the rule book. Embarrassed by the walkout, the brand new conference the two schools belonged to passed a new rule the following season. Any team that forfeited a scheduled game would be fined $50. Missouri paid the fine once, then folded, playing Nebraska and Flippin in both 1893 and 1894. His teammates elected him team captain in 1894. Nebraska's own coach wouldn't let it stand. A black man wasn't going to captain the team, whatever the vote said. When Flippin died in 1929, by then a small town doctor who'd built the first hospital in Stromsburg, Nebraska, the local sports writers eulogized him like a legend. One compared him to a charging bull bred with a tiger's ferocity. What those obituaries left out: the next black player to wear a Nebraska uniform, a lineman named Clinton Ross, lasted 3 seasons before Kansas State's coach threatened to boycott a 1913 game rather than face him. Nebraska played the game anyway, but nobody suited up for the Huskers again until 1952, 39 years later. In 1946, the conference made the old unwritten understanding official, adopting a written policy that let a home team bar a black visiting player if that state already had its own law against interracial competition. One observer called it exactly what it was: the gentleman's agreement, just in writing now. 3 schools, 3 pioneers, all before 1893, and all 3 programs eventually did some version of the same thing: open the door, then close it. That closing wasn't random. It had a name. By the early 20th century, college football had become a genuinely national sport. Northern schools and Southern schools started scheduling each other. Northern programs had integrated modestly, 1 or 2 players at a time. Southern programs hadn't, and under Jim Crow, legally couldn't. So when the 2 sides agreed to play, an unwritten understanding took hold. Whatever black player the northern team had on its roster would sit that game out. No shared authority governed it. No rule was written down anywhere. It was handled quietly, coach to coach, and everybody involved called it gentlemanly. This happened constantly, and not in obscure programs. In the 1930s alone, it's documented at least 21 separate times. At Michigan, Ohio State, Michigan State, Minnesota, Indiana, Iowa, plus a string of Ivy League schools. Fitzhugh Lyons and Jesse Babb sat out for Indiana when Mississippi State came to Bloomington, Indiana's own home field. Wendy Wallace and Boris Dickerson were benched when Iowa played George Washington University. Iowa's coach told reporters he'd asked the 2 players to sit out for the good of the sport. The Naval Academy refused outright to play Ohio State's Bill Bell, but had no objection to a light-skinned Cuban player on NYU's roster that same season. The color line, it turned out, ran on some very selective eyesight. In 1934, Georgia Tech told Michigan they'd only play the scheduled game in Ann Arbor on Michigan's own campus if Michigan benched its star end, a black player named Willis Ward. Michigan agreed. Georgia Tech reciprocated by benching its own star end so neither team would look like it had won anything unfair. Both squads took the field a man short in a game that existed only because a black man wasn't allowed to be in it. Students didn't take it quietly. A group calling itself the Ward United Front Committee collected 1,500 signatures demanding Ward play or the game be canceled. The campus held what one newspaper called the wildest and strangest Friday night rally in Michigan's history. None of it changed the outcome. Ward wasn't even allowed to watch the game from his own team's bench. Athletic director Fielding Yost had taken rumors of a field protest seriously enough to hire the Pinkerton Detective Agency to investigate the students organizing on Ward's behalf. 2 agents spent a day on campus and reported back a list of ringleaders. There was no protest being planned. Yost had paid strangers to spy on his own students over nothing. His roommate and closest friend on the team, a lineman named Gerald Ford, threatened to quit in protest. Ward talked him out of it, told him the team needed him. Ford played. 3 decades later, as a member of Congress, he voted for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. He said he never forgot that Saturday. Not every Southern coach played along either. In 1937, Southern Methodist University took the field against UCLA and its 2 black stars, Kenny Washington and Woody Strode, without benching anybody. SMU's coach Matty Bell had played pro football alongside black teammates himself and said flatly that he thought every boy should get his chance regardless of color. No boycott followed, no forfeit, nothing. The agreement was never as airtight or as unanimous as the schools that kept honoring it liked to claim. The system started cracking in 1940 at NYU. The school had a black player named Leonard Bates, and when NYU scheduled Missouri, the gentleman's agreement kicked in automatically. Bates was benched. This time, students didn't take it quietly. They picketed campus with signs that read, "Bates must play and end Jim Crow in sports," and they demanded NYU never schedule a segregated opponent on those terms again. It didn't change that particular game, but for the first time, the arrangement had to be defended out loud instead of handled behind closed doors. World War II helped accelerate the breakdown of the agreement. Men who'd fought, in many cases fought alongside black soldiers, even in a still segregated military, came home with a lot less patience for the idea that a teammate needed anyone's permission to play. College rosters filled up with GI Bill veterans who'd seen combat. Some of those veteran teammates started threatening to boycott their own trip south if a black player was left behind. That kind of pressure, coming from inside the locker room, did more to erode the old arrangement than a decade of protest had managed on its own. The clearest early proof came in January of 1948, when Penn State reached the Cotton Bowl in Dallas with two black players on the roster, Wally Triplett and Denny Hoggard. SMU's own coach, Matty Bell, pushed Cotton Bowl officials to extend the invitation anyway, the same coach who years earlier had taken the field against Kenny Washington and Woody Strode without benching either one. "We have no objections ourselves," he told the Dallas Morning News. Word still reached the Penn State locker room that somebody wanted to meet and hash the matter out further. Team captain Steve Suhi shut it down before it started. "We are Penn State," he said. "There will be no meetings." No hotel in Dallas would house the team, so Penn State bunked at a nearby Navy base instead. Triplett caught the tying touchdown in a 13-13 game against a Doak Walker-led SMU squad, becoming the first black player to score a touchdown in a major college game inside a former Confederate state. I have a full video about the "We Are Penn State" motto if you like to watch it. By the 50s, the old arrangement was falling apart, though not gone. As late as January 1956, the Sugar Bowl in New Orleans still hadn't seen a single black player in 20 years of existence, and Georgia's governor tried to force Georgia Tech to pull out of that year's game rather than face a Pittsburgh team with a black player named Bobby Greer on the roster. Georgia Tech's president refused to back down. The game was played, and Greer became the first black player to appear in a bowl game in the Deep South. 64 years after Flippin first took the field for Nebraska. By the early 60s, the old formal arrangement was mostly dead in the North, but it left something behind almost as effective, an unwritten ceiling. The historian Charles Martin, whose book Benching Jim Crow remains the definitive study of this whole era, found that dozens of northern universities had excluded black players from their own rosters entirely, well into the 1940s, with no southern opponent or scheduled game involved at all. Even the programs that did open up rarely opened up far. USC sat in the middle of one of the most diverse cities in the country and still carried only 5 black players on its 1962 national championship team and 7 on its 1967 championship team, one of them O.J. Simpson. Nobody at USC ever announced a quota. Nobody had to. The roster counted itself. A genuinely integrated team, deep at every position, was still close to unthinkable at the top level of the sport. Then a coach in East Lansing, Michigan decided the ceiling was stupid and just stopped observing it. Duffy Daugherty didn't look like a revolutionary. Short, stocky, the son of Scottish immigrants out of a Pennsylvania coal town, known mostly for corny jokes and a soft spot for his players. He took over as Michigan State's head coach in 1954, inheriting a program that was already recruiting a modest number of black players under his predecessor, Big E. Munn. What Daugherty did, starting around 1959, was refuse to stop at the number everyone else quietly agreed was the limit. The system that made it possible started with black high school coaches across the segregated South, not with Daugherty. Their best players were barred from the flagship universities in their own home states simply because of skin color, and those coaches started calling Michigan State directly. We've got a kid who could start anywhere in the country, and there's no path for him here. Will you take him? The first player to make that trip was Clifton Rofe out of Pine Bluff, Arkansas in 1959. That same year, a halfback named Sherman Lewis came up from Louisville, Kentucky, and by 1963, he'd finished third in the Heisman Trophy voting, the highest finish yet for one of Daugherty's passengers. 3 years later, a linebacker out of Roanoke, Virginia, named Charlie Thornhill, got a look from Michigan State too. A white sports writer back home made an unsolicited call to the coaching staff, simply because he thought the kid deserved a shot. Rofe, by then a senior on campus, hosted Thornhill's recruiting visit himself. That's how the pipeline actually worked, one relationship at a time, built by people with no formal connection to the program who decided the talent shouldn't go to waste. Michigan State's own players eventually gave it a name, borrowed from Harriet Tubman, the Underground Railroad. Between 1959 and 1972, 44 black players made that trip north, from every part of the segregated South except Alabama, Tennessee, and Maryland. By 1962, the Associated Press was already calling Michigan State's 17 black players the largest such group in the history of major college football. By 1966, it was 20 on a 67-man roster. And in September of 1964, Daugherty did something that would have been unthinkable under the old gentleman's agreement. He took his team south. Michigan State traveled to Kenan Stadium in Chapel Hill to play North Carolina with a fully integrated roster on Southern soil. 24 years earlier, NYU students had needed picket signs and a boycott threat just to keep one black player from being benched. Daugherty didn't ask permission, he just showed up with the whole team. Those rosters produced some of the most decorated players in the sport's history. Bubba Smith, a defensive end out of Beaumont, Texas, whose own father, a high school coach, had helped run players north. Gene Washington, also out of Texas. George Webster, a linebacker from Anderson, South Carolina, who some of his contemporaries thought should have won the Heisman outright in 1966. Clinton Jones, a running back from Cleveland. And Jimmy Ray, a quarterback out of Fayetteville, North Carolina, who in 1966 became the first black quarterback from the South to start for and win a national championship, a job he legally could not have held at most flagship universities back home. That 1966 team tied Notre Dame 10-10 in the game the press called the Game of the Century, watched by 33 million people, the largest television audience for a sporting event up to that point. Both teams ended up sharing the national title. Michigan State started a dozen black players that day. None of this was simple once players got to campus. Ray said later that when his mother weighed sending him to Michigan State, football barely entered into it. She wanted to know if he'd actually get his degree. Once he got there, black students numbered only a couple hundred out of a campus of tens of thousands, and by his own account, they mostly stuck together. Getting out of the segregated South didn't mean landing in an integrated one. Ray's mother, it turns out, had nothing to worry about. Of the 44 players who rode the Underground Railroad between 1959 and 1972, 30 of them, roughly 68%, graduated. 20 years later, in 1984, the national graduation rate for black college football players had fallen to about 30%, which is part of why the NCAA eventually imposed stricter academic eligibility rules in the first place. Daugherty wasn't just moving talent north. He was running one of the only programs in the country where a black athlete's degree was treated as seriously as his 40-yard dash time. The NFL noticed the talent too. At the 1967 draft, 4 members of that single 1963 recruiting class, Smith, Jones, Webster, and Washington, were all selected among the first 8 picks. Smith went first overall to the Baltimore Colts. No program had ever produced a haul like that, and every one of those 4 players had been told, at some point back home, that there simply wasn't room for him. Southern programs started moving because they were watching too much talent walk out the back door and beat them with it. Bubba Smith put it plainly years later: losing changed minds. Guilt never did. And they moved slowly and unevenly, and only when the talent drain got embarrassing enough. In 1965, Jerry Levias signed with Southern Methodist University, the first black scholarship football player in the entire Southwest Conference. He drew death threats serious enough that city, state, and federal officers had to watch for snipers before one road game. In 1966, the same year Michigan State's fully integrated roster was winning a share of the national championship, the Southeastern Conference finally signed its first 2 black players anywhere in the league, Greg Page and Nat Northington, both at Kentucky. Page never got to play a down. He was paralyzed in a practice collision that spring, spent 40 days in a coma, and died. Northington played on alone, the only black player in the entire SEC for most of that season. That's the actual distance between the 2 stories. In East Lansing, 20 black players were starting on a national championship team. That same year, one conference over, in the heart of the South, the whole SEC had 2 black players total, and one of them didn't even survive to take the field. Jackson took the field at Amherst in 1889 as one man alone, hoping talent would be enough. For most of the next 80 years, it wasn't. Programs let in 1 player, maybe 2, called it progress, and moved on. Today, black athletes make up roughly 40% of major college football rosters. In the NFL, it's a clear majority, over 53%, according to the league's own most recent count. Daugherty's 1966 championship team, with 20 black players out of 67, was radical enough to make the Associated Press. By today's numbers, that roster wouldn't be exceptional. It would be a little bit below average. Flippin, Jewett, Jackson, and Lewis proved it could be done. It took Daugherty's generation and the black high school coaches across the South who built his pipeline for him to prove it could be done at scale. And once that was proven, the rest of the sport ran out of excuses. I'm John Johnston with Hardcore College Football History. Thanks for watching.